Dear colleagues, thank you for accepting our invitation. As you may know, today the Central Bank's board decided to reduce by half a percentage point the refinancing rate, setting it at 9.75 hundredths of a percent. Mr. Galstyan will present to you the press release. Thank you. Good afternoon. On September 12, 2023, at its session, the Central Bank board decided to reduce the financing rate by half a percentage point, setting it at 9.75. In August 23, the 12-month inflation remained almost unchanged, amounting to minus 0.2%. The 12-month core inflation continued to decrease, reaching 0.4% by the end of August. The risks of decline in global economic activity have increased substantially in the main partner countries of the Republic of Armenia. The 12-month inflation keeps on decelerating, but the prices of goods and services with sticky prices remain elevated. Consequently, the central banks of partner countries will continue to conduct a relatively contractionary monetary policy under tight financial conditions and the slowdown in global economic activity. Prices in international commodity markets will further stand at low levels. As a result, deflationary effects on the Armenian economy from external sector will sustain. In Q3 2023, high growth rate of economic activity in the Republic of Armenia slowed down, still staying at a high level. The economic growth continues to be supported by high growth in the construction and services. The latter bear the effects of strong domestic and external demand in the economy. Under the conditions of deflationary effects from the external sector, the implemented contractionary monetary policy and dram appreciation, the high demand contributing to inflation, and the inflation expectations have somewhat decreased. Nevertheless, inflation in services and some goods is adjusting relatively more slower. The Board of the Central Bank of Armenia finds it appropriate to reduce the policy rate. The board will be consistent in taking action to handle demand and stabilize inflation expectations. As outlined in the monetary policy scenario, the 12-month inflation will remain below the target in the near future. Thereafter, it will gradually increase and stabilize around 4% target in medium term. The Central Bank Board estimates that the risks of the inflation deviating from the projected trajectory are mostly balanced. In the event, if these risks materialize in any direction, the board will react adequately in fulfillment of the price stability objective. Thank you. Arka, please. Mr. Galstyan, what's the macroeconomic estimate predictions of the central bank? Did it change, and based on what, if at all? And the second question, in its last analysis, Standard & Poor's mentioned that there are risks in Armenia around the market which increased by about 30% alongside the increase in real estate. How does the central bank assess these risks, and what precautionary measures are taken, if any? Thank you. I started with that slide in response to your question. According to our projections, since essentially this is a programmatic meeting, we have reviewed the economic growth indicators. Instead of 6.9, it's 7.2 now, mostly determined by the services and construction high growth rates. As for Standard & Poor's assessment, you know that in our report on financial stability we have acknowledged certain risks about the prices of housing, but at this point in time we observe a certain increase. If I'm not mistaken, within the last month the prices for housing increased by 1.1%. Over the last year it was 8.8. The last number is for July. As to what measures are being implemented by the central bank, you know that the LTV has been made more tight counter-cyclical buffer requirement has already entered into effect, if I'm not mistaken, as of August. Total 150 base points, which is appropriately 90 billion drams of capital in the banking system. If overheating continually takes place, we have the appropriate toolkit, and we will apply the macroprudential toolkit in that case, civilly net. Thank you, Mr. Galstyan. The central bank, that is through its board, decided to reduce the rate. This is the third one in the near past, in July, August, and now. Apart from inflationary reasons, I know that your mission is inflation on target, but is it also determined by the slowdown in economic growth rates? How will these affect the slowing down of economic growth? With your permission, I will highlight a few items and then I'll try to answer your question. I believe that the central bank, in general terms, in retrospect, has implemented an extremely good monetary policy, well weighted, reasonable. You can use modifiers to your liking, and I acknowledge it now, giving out such modifiers in the past, because we now feel that the work we did is yielding its results. We may consider what we implemented to be final and completed. Of course not, because certain risks for possible inflationary development still persist. In particular, we have a certain group of goods with sticky prices where there is still a certain trend of price increase. There are sectors of the economy which still have a growth and a high level of wages. We're still above a potential GDP by our growth rates. There are issues that have not been resolved for good, but as of this point in time, we acknowledge that the decisions we had been taking long before many other countries, we opted for the more stringent path, and this is beginning to yield its fruit. Of course, the processes in the economy are interrelated and anchored to monetary processes. The low demand will result in weaker inflation, which we already covered. And as you mentioned, this is the third successive reduction of the interest rate. And I believe that this is the result of our precautionary policy, that today the central bank is in a position to reduce the rate, whereas many countries in the world are still raising it. And if this lowering of the rate will in its turn also contribute to some economic developments, we would view that as a positive. Hayastan News. Thank you, Vahe Makarian, Mr. Galstyan. This is picking up where my colleague left in the same logic. If I constructed your words of praise properly by raising 3 successive times the rate, you had increased it by up to 10.75. We decreased it 3 times. You decreased it from 10.75. So you restrained inflation, right? And it's now conducive environment to reduce the interest rate now. So ancillary to that, both during reducing 3 times as well as now, do we have an analysis whether the banks have adequately or concurrently reduced their financing interest rates? Is it their discretion or are they bound to do it? I would also like to know whether this will affect or did affect the mortgage rates. Vahejan, if we recall, we started as of December 21. The stringent phase lasted over 2 years in Armenia, as a result of which we succeeded to overcome inflation. Linking this to previous question by Arshalus, we believe that economic growth that we project for this year would be the extremely good growth. Thinking about 7% economic growth being taken for granted, no, it's very high, both in international context. You have to look at the essence of the double-digit growth. It was determined essentially by demand. That was a short-term phenomenon. From the fundamental perspective, if we look at the 7.2 economic growth and formation of new layers of productivity in our economy, which will result in our capacity to create potential economic growth. This is very important and more important than having for 1 year a double-digit economic growth. Our concern and our preoccupation should focus on having economic growth which is replete with productive potential. As for our rate, when we were increasing the interest rate, we started from 4.25 up all the way to 10.75, which was quite substantial. The banks did not increase their lending rates by 7% concurrently, so believing that it's a one-to-one correlation between our rate and the bank's rate would not be appropriate. There is no binding duty. It's like any competitive market, supply-demand, factoring in risks and potential developments. As to how shall this one affect the bank's rate, if the overall risk environment is mitigated to some extent, we believe that over time we may expect that the bank lending percentage will also be adjusted towards going down, as well as the mortgages, which will be the baseline for lending. Mortgages are more specific because in mortgage lending there is this idea built in of the floating rate, which is linked to the baseline core rate. We have observed that while we were increasing the rate, the mortgage rates have somewhat increased. Naturally, once we decrease the core rate downwards, the correlation with the baseline will result in adjusting downwards the mortgage interest rates. Depends on the risks. It's not just the price of money that plays a role here, but also the overall situation in the market, which has multiple contributing components. That's what I'm saying. If we put aside those other risks and look at net macroeconomic or financial risks, focus thereupon, quite naturally loosening up monetary conditions will result in certain competitive environment in the reduction of the interest rates. There is a great linkage between our rate and the T-bills, of course. These two markets are more interrelated than the lending market. And as a result of reduction of our interest rate, we've already seen that the line of yield of T-bills has also gone down, and as of this iteration there will be adjustment in their returns as well. In our last meeting in this hall, the national currency was described as there being possible scenarios of both evaluation and devaluation, appreciation and devaluation. Since foreign analysts have come up with opinions that the dram will start to devalue because of the increase of remittances, that's what the S&P says. Does the central bank tweak its opinion in view of this? If we're talking about our projections about the inflation, then we believe that end of this year we'll have inflation close to zero. Through the next year we'll get close to our 4% target. As for scenarios, essentially you're quite right. If we're talking scenario developments, there may be one let's assume in the background of current geopolitical developments, there could be a new influx of international visitors to Armenia. As a result, we may have increased supply of foreign currency, and we may expect that the dram may appreciate to some extent. In the event of another type of a scenario, let's say our compatriots create a product over years and it goes to consumption. Most of consumption is in imports because they repair apartments, they travel, etc., which increases demand for foreign currency, which may result, as you mentioned, in gap in the current accounts. As a result, there will be certain devaluation of the national currency. Since we're a small open economy and our currency is free floating, we do not want to anchor expectations anchored towards a certain exchange rate, which is what we're trying through our actions to overcome. Life has demonstrated that even in the most difficult of crises during 2020, for example, our activities which were aiming at overcoming the fear towards the floating exchange were successful. We used the forex as for absorption of the shocks. As a result, I believe what's transpiring now, a certain tension, you feel that this tension doesn't substantially affect the financial markets, and that's what we acknowledge as well, which is a source of satisfaction for us, CivilNet. Mr. Galstyan, you mentioned this year's economic growth will be, so to say, quite good. What are the fundamentals that lead you to believe that? Because if we look at the structural breakdown of the growth, it's more or less similar to last year's growth. The drivers are somewhat weaker. Services, construction, that is, and exports, re-exports, and a little bit of domestic trade. So what leads you to believe the structure doesn't seem to have changed, or it transformed towards something worse because the industry and processing have shrunk and are shrinking? And about remittances, the follow-up questions. When last year we observed this year, last year's higher influx, with the difference that the flows outgoing also have increased. Last year annually we got $500 million, 60% stayed here, 40% went out. To put it bluntly, nowadays, give or take, 20 or 30% stay and the rest goes out. What does this indicate? The country has become a channel for exodus of funds from Russia abroad, or what? In reality, it's very difficult to come up with the profound analysis just over 1 year's data, especially if the year was exceptional in every ramification thereof. But there's one thing that's becoming obvious for us. If you looked at the impact of remittances 10 years ago on Armenian economy compared to the same impact now, by its magnitude and effect, the weight of the remittances have substantially decreased. Therefore, naturally, the situation is also determined by developments taking place in Russia and with Russia. Historically, the influx of remittances was originating mostly in the Russian Federation. As to what may happen in the future, one should apply various scenarios here as well. There is one obvious, or focusing on one baseline scenario will leave too much room for error. As for the outflow of remittances, there are several funds flowing out of Armenia. That is, one phenomenon would be that we will start to consume more because the appreciation of dram as well as last year's economic growth will inspire us to believe we're richer than a year or two before, which one should approach quite cautiously as citizens, as individuals, because this phenomenon may not last long. So one has to be more cautious about it. It may result in a certain increase of imports, which spells outflow of funds. In the labor market, we also have a new phenomenon which is determined, for example, by migrants coming in, or labor migrants coming in from India to Armenia, which is something that's been happening over the last couple of years, not on the same scale before. And this naturally leads to an interesting situation. There will be also a certain outflow from Armenia of funds to the countries of origin of these labor migrants, because they believe Armenia is a better place, a normal environment to live and work in. As for the quality of economic growth, quite naturally, all of us would wish to have economic growth in competitive, export-oriented sectors. At this point in time, one sector stands out, and it's services. Services, as a rule, have always been viewed by us as non-exportable. The Armenian horeca or the financial sector mostly catered to the domestic economy, whereas now there is a certain slant catering to external demand as well. We also have certain positive developments in the IT sector. We observe that there is an influx of qualified human resources. Talking with the IT guys, they acknowledge how the work environment and culture are transforming. Work ethics is changing, productivity and efficiency gain. So in the services we also have positive developments. As for construction, one must say that, and this has been mentioned in the cabinet more than once, what matters here is to transform volume and quantity into quality. Environmentally clean production, value-oriented construction. So we may be embarking on the stage of more stringent building code requirements, which is good for this country. So transition from quantitative growth to quality growth. 7.2 is a very good number. Granted. Let me clarify one more thing about the outflows. We have 4,000 to 5,000 labor migrants from China, give or take. This is substantial a number for Armenia, but no big deal. But in any case, when we see, as of the last 8 months, about $2 billion outflow of the country, if I get you right, you're not referring to the natural persons remittances. You refer to both trade flows and natural persons remittances. Yes. Does this phenomenon contain a component of re-exporting for goods to come in here and go to Russia? It's very difficult to assess the re-exports because we're members of the Eurasian Economic Union and there is customs regulations. But if last year our estimate was that re-exports were an X number, this year it's substantially lower. Mr. Makarian. About the dollar-drum ratio, Mr. Galstyan, this reduction of the interest rate, does it pursue an objective of appreciation of dollars and devaluing drums? Now that you reduce the rate, there may be an excess of drums in the market, and may that have an impact on its devaluation? Whether reducing the refinancing rate may affect the weakening of the drum, theoretically, yes. Naturally, if you reduce the rate, the asset becomes less attractive from investor perspective, especially if on the other hand you see that in Europe and the United States there is still a trend in place of growth in rates. But this needs to be adjusted. You mentioned whether there is an intention in this increase to affect the forex. Not in the least, because the objective of the central bank is still price stability. We are abiding by our mandate of maintaining price stability. As of this point in time, thanks to our work done so far, we may afford ourselves to make money cheaper in this country. As a result, there will be some side effects. One of them could be the forex rate. There may be other incarnations, but our objective is the mandate we've been entrusted to have a 4% inflation in this country. That's what we're after. Mr. Gareginyan is asking remotely a question. In August, the structure of the inflation has persisted. Unregulated services prices are still high. What could be the inflationary risks here? And does today's decision mean that the risks are more manageable than in winter or spring months? Yes, today's decision on the interest rate means that the risks are more manageable. That was good language. Than in the spring or, for that matter, winter months. But we cannot state that the issue of inflation has been resolved for good in this country. We still have work to do, but quite naturally, thanks to what we have done in the past, today's work has become easier. When the Prime Minister of Russia was here and had a meeting with our counterpart of his, there was this language. Yerevan is proposing to Moscow to increase the use of domestic currencies in bilateral trade, which would contribute to increased trade turnover and diversifying structure thereof. What's the promise held in this, in your opinion? I believe this is beyond our remit, whether we will be able to service this decision if all of a sudden there is a decision to revert to national currencies in the bilateral trade. Yes, I believe we can, but that will happen or not, that's not, we do not affect that. The infrastructure and the technology will allow for that, and I assume, yes, that will be possible. Mr. Galstyan, are we thinking about creating digital currency in the Republic of Armenia? Various countries are considering that elsewhere. Dear Arshalis, since you were present at our 30th anniversary symposium, and I understand the context that you're asking this question in, because there was a panel discussing exactly that. In that symposium, we already commenced the work towards that direction several months ago. As to whether I may be able to report at this point in time that we're fully certain that having digital currency is needed in Armenia, no, we're still researching. Once our research is over, we will definitely duly notify you about that. Mr. Gareginyan has several follow-up questions. In the loan portfolio of enterprises is growing in trade and construction, not in processing. Does this mean that in the months to come the services-based economic growth will persist and the same inflationary risk may also accompany them? I would not like to talk about short-term developments, because the objective of all of us is to arrive at long-term stable quality economic growth. As for processing industry lending, I believe that the project that the government is implementing, subsidies or leasing, last year and this year it has gained momentum. This of course contributed to this was contributed to by the strength of the local currency, because re-equipping industry is cheaper now naturally for those companies today than this assumed 3 years ago. Therefore, we believe that as a result of this re-equipping, our processing industry will also undergo substantial qualitative transformations. As for services, I already reflected on that. The objective should be to have both in financial and hospitality or IT sectors quality services. Eventually, the way I see it, the formula should be as follows: to have as high quality and economic growth as possible, and the high quality of GDP structure for small open economies competing with larger ones. Price-wise is next to impossible. Any more questions? Failing that, yes, the public broadcaster has a question. How come in August petrol got more expensive and some agricultural produce increased? How come inflation went down? The inflation is not only determined by those particular goods, but by a basket which has 470 goods and services in it. Used to have, I assume it's about the same. We're talking about 500 goods and services in this basket. Quite naturally, there'll be some goods that will have a higher inflation, increase in prices, and there will be goods that will have a fall in prices. And as a result of the striking a balance, we have full trust in the estimates of the Statistics Committee. We have no reason not to believe in these, particularly for the month of August as well. So we have what we have, and we implement our policies accordingly. Are there any types of good that have a disproportionate impact in the total? For example, fuel, which is quite high in its demand. So are there weights attached to certain goods in their impact on the basket? Very well. Let's look at how things stand as a result. As a result of surveys in the households, the Statistics Committee is trying to come up with an average of Armenian household basket structure. So what do we consume and in what volumes? Quite naturally, there are goods and services who have a higher weight attached to them, like bread, or maybe at this point in time it could be meat or vegetables or fruit, and there are goods that essentially have less of a weight in the basket. As for the impact thereof, all of these weights added come up with their total impact on the overall inflation. There's a methodology for that. As for fuel, it's 5%. You remember, let's say 15 or 20 years ago, it was petrol, now it's petrol, LNG, CNG, solar generated power, EVs. So the changes in the structure naturally will result in the weight of petrol-fired vehicles having less of an impact, and therefore consumption of petrol will reduce. In the basket of this year 23, there is 45.9% of food products in the overall basket, which has increased over the last year. In last year's basket it was 41.6%. So if we look at which goods affect the basket most, it's predominantly food, and food is the group of products that had the biggest fall in prices. August over last year had 4% of decrease in the group of food products and alcoholic beverage, non-alcoholic beverages. So there is 4% deflation in this group. On the services, Mr. Galstyan mentioned that still have inflationary phenomena. The weight of services in the basket is 32%. That's just to give you an overall idea who moves the basket. So 2 more questions by Galstyan. Economic agents do sales in Armenia on below average prices. Does central bank confirm that? And is not imported goods now more competitive versus domestic production? Are there any risks of shrinking of domestic production? Half jokingly, in the long term, like Kinsey said, we will all be dead. As for competitiveness of local products vis-a-vis imported ones, we should look at it in mid-term perspective, essentially, because determined by certain momentary actions or inaction, we may have certain appreciation of the national currency, which may create certain inconveniences for this or that economic agent or sector, which is why I'm saying the most important issue is to arrive at significant qualitative changes, when you will not be dependent on such small fluctuations in the prices or exchange. As for Russian Federation economic agents exporting to Armenia at lower prices, I cannot really answer, but one thing that's certain, and Vaimakaran was asking about the fuel as well. If I'm not mistaken, the predominant majority of petrol imported to Armenia is imported from Russia, and in Russia we observe within the last 1 year that petrol prices have gone up by about 75%. That will of course translate onto the Armenian market, and will make I have difficulties of answering about other products. The last question about China, as always. The construction and real estate problems in the Chinese market, may they result in difficulties in the global markets, in particular copper prices? I can't say for copper prices because I do not know their linkage to construction of this commodity. It's more associated with other production, maybe machine tool production or others, but the fact that the current difficulties in China will have a certain impact on overall global economic growth, I think that's quite probable. Thank you. $8,800, which is a good price, quite high, I believe. Thank you.